Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
So, have you done anything special for what is this? The April Fool's Day? Are you one that always puts some meme or joke on Facebook, or did you call up your friends and tell them something silly? Or
No, but I swim every morning. That's why my hair always looks horrible. And there's a really old lady. A beautiful
yeah,
older woman.
thank you.
Yeah, but I don't think I think she knows she's old. She, but she swims where I swim, and every year she claims a different animal is in the pool.
Oh,
Um,
that is hilarious. For April Fool's Day.
Yeah, and so today I saw her come out, and then she's got some, poor 21-year-old, sleep deprived employee, and she said there was a snake in here, and I saw it. It went into this thing, and he's like taking apart the vent, and then of course she lets him know April Fools, and then this kid is just like, oh my god, Anyway, it's great. I love it.
I think that's actually cute. So
Yeah.
you're an observer of an acquaintance swimmer friend of yours doing April Fools, but you don't pull your own pranks or you don't do your own deal.
No, I'm not because I'm not crazy about practical jokes myself. Like I don't really, pull them on other people.
Yeah,
I'm I'll be sarcastic or and I joke around, but in terms of
right.
like actually pulling pranks, I don't know. It's just not where my head's at most of the time. I can't dedicate the mental energy to being creative.
And it is mental energy. The folks that do it well, it's a real skill set to weave a tale or create something. It does take energy, I think, to do it well.
Well, if I thought of a good one, I would pull it. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of
Okay.
like Halloween costumes. I'm also terrible at Halloween costumes too.
Yeah, we were peas in a pod. The only one I had that was good on that was G. Gordon Liddy. I can pull off a pretty good G. Gordon Liddy.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a good. I'll see if my 10-year-old wants to dress up as G. Gordon Liddy.
Yeah, because that is so fun. And you just hold
Yeah,
your arm over a flame, really. So
yeah,
anyway, so Professor, which is kind of funny. We're talking about funny things. Is the United States funny? Yeah, seeing your arm melt in prison to show your prison guards you're tough.
yeah.
Gordon, that's kind of funny, actually. Yikes. Um, so I wanted to do this conversation intentionally. And here's the reason. And you have zero idea what we're going to be talking about, which is just great. So thanks for playing along with me. Um, I wanted to do it because you and I differ a little bit. I have given you a quote or two over the last year that says, like, happy is the country with no history. And I think that kind of like offended you a little bit because, like, I think the purpose of that quote is like history is made of wars and famine and economic disasters and troubles in paradise. And that's what's in the history, but all these horrible things, assassinations, and yeah, all the stuff that befalls the human race. And if things are just great, if it's peaceful and you're just living your life, well, what do you write about? Hey, I went to work and I planted in the field and no one got killed. It's,
Yeah.
what is there to do if everything's hunky dory? And you kind of disagree with that a little bit. I think you think history is replete with all sorts of stuff, good, bad, and ugly. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess there are these debates about the end of history and what history actually means, and it depends on how you define it. But if you define history as being the world as it was before the United States came along, but the way I usually describe it is that our system doesn't make us immune from history, but what our system does is it moderates it, so that these things that we think of as acts of evil or something, they drop into our system and we still have them. They just don't become what they would become under other systems. So if you think of like the Holocaust happening in Germany, well, what we get is Japanese internment, which is not good. But if you take those same impulses during war and you put it into a system that moderates these impulses, what you get is something that is less evil than what you would get under a non-pluralistic system. So it doesn't make us immune from history, but it moderates history.
And that's not the purpose of today's show, but I do want to ask a question on it to make sure I understand you. The framing of the Constitution by having competing interests, the executive versus the legislative, and states versus federal, and judicial oversight, and and Senate confirmation. I mean, all these different checks and balances moderate things to make sure that if it works, it's just constantly different power structures or political parties are challenging the other one, the free press, blah, 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 right? And so it usually doesn't get to the disaster scene.
Well, I mean, it's still a disaster in the American context, but not compared to what goes on in the rest of the world.
Okay, cool. So let's kind of go the opposite. I meant what I said is the United States fun? I mean, like if other people think about the United States, is that something that comes to mind when they go, oh, the United States, man, those people are fun. And are we funny? I mean, do we tell jokes and do we enjoy plowing the fields, or do we enjoy our families? Do we enjoy our leisure time? Like occasionally our European friends will say, you guys are nuts, 2 weeks of vacation. We could take all summer off, or a month, everybody gets a month off. Yeah. And they think we just work too hard. And I don't know if that's true or not, that we work harder. You study some of this, but is America fun? Just in general, are we fun? Are we funny? Or are we just a tough, relentless part of our species? What are we?
Yes, I think that, one of the things that if you travel and see Americans abroad, one of the things that people will always note is that we do tend to be an energetic and joyous people, and that we're boisterous, we're energetic, and I like to think of it as what's incredible is how often the American spirit has been renewed, because we're not actually a young country. We're an old country now, and yet we still have this youthful exuberance and energy about us as a culture, constantly innovating and constantly. What we're really good at is the creation of joyous pop culture.
We'll get to that. Sorry to interrupt you, but pop culture is a whole conversation unto its own.
I'll say even the times when people think of as being very dour, you think of like the Puritans, but the Puritans had fun. One of the lesser known lines from Model of Christian Charity is that we're supposed to delight in one another. You are ordered to delight in one another, and I would think that's something that's been somewhat forgotten, because we tend to think of people who are religious maybe as being very dour, but you don't forget that when you're actually in it, that you are supposed to take delight in the joys and successes of others, and that's not a recipe for being upset and dour and upset and sad.
So, but that was the Puritans. I remember I didn't do very well in history classes. I thought they didn't dance and didn't drink and and were pious. And you're saying the Puritans, part of their mandate was to enjoy life?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and there's another good Edmund Morgan book, The Puritan Family, that just if you'd like to know more about like the Puritan family structure and how they spent their time and stuff like that, and what you see is like, yeah, they enjoyed themselves.
Wow. So speaking of Morgan, as I'm wont to do, I always want to go kind of back to the founding of our country to see how it's changed over the centuries. One of those other books you made me read, American Freedom, American National, American Freedom, is that it?
Freedom National.
It went in great detail. I think it was that, or maybe it's American Slavery, American
Freedom. That's the Morgan book.
Yeah, that's the Morgan book I'm thinking of. It went into huge, ad nauseum detail of Virginia and how brutal it was for most of these settlers. It came from England, and many non-voluntarily, because they were probably drunk or they were desperate or they were starving and they needed to come over here, and then they couldn't really get out of their indentured servitude. That's how my family came here around that time frame. And it didn't seem like fun at all. It was like the hard work all darn day long, and they're getting attacked, and they have lousy bosses, and they're kind of stuck with some kind of involuntary servitude, maybe for their life. To me, it was a brutal book. it wasn't fun at all. The founding of our country did not seem like it was. Maybe for the rich people it was really fun, but am I wrong? Did I read that wrong? Or, I mean, were we founded with fun?
Well, it was, you're absolutely right that the Virginia colony was pretty brutal, and frontier existence could be very rough. And you were always subject to arbitrary violence. But, Virginia was not the only colony. And rich and poor really had almost nothing to do with it. Having money wouldn't have saved you from most of the things that made life very difficult for colonists. But one of the things about freedom and prosperity is it kind of creeps up on you and you take it for granted. And you only notice that things are better when over the passage of time, or when other people come, or when you travel. And so one of the things that is notable is, by the time 100 years or so have passed, Americans don't really understand how good things are by the 1740s, 50s, 60s. But when British people come here, it's confusing to them. How is it that this place that is supposed to be a backwater is in many ways nicer than where I left? England is supposed to be this great power, and you have all these accounts of English soldiers, for instance, saying, well, this is nice, in terms of, we had the most literate culture in the world in the North. And number two wasn't even close. I mean, there was no place even close to our literacy rates, and also the variety of foods that we ate, the quality of food that we ate, the invention of grandparents. This is one of the first places in the world where you would have contact with your grandparents, because it was pretty common to have grandparents who were alive, because we had one of the best living standards in the world after 100 years or so of settlement. So, talking
right around the founding of our country, we had things pretty good.
Yeah, in the decades right before, and certainly by 1776, I mean, it would have been clear that most Americans were living better, certainly in the North, and on the coastal areas. Most Americans were living better than most people on Earth by that time.
Fascinating. And so you think, as part of that, because if you've got a well-rounded meal plan and there was more leisure time, and therefore more fun, or
not necessarily, but labor doesn't necessarily make you unhappy. I one of the things that's always shocking, and I have to go back and look at this, but I remember reading this book about the history of American agriculture, and it went through what the caloric intake of an American was in the 1820s. And Americans in the 1820s were consuming 10, 12, 15 times what we consume in calories today.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, and it's all just like pork and corn. Americans just eat tons of corn in every form. And corn is just electric. I mean, it's so dense with energy and sugar. It's just basically sugar. And nobody was fat. So but everyone was engaged in very intense physical labor. So the average person was engaged in intense physical labor from sunup to sundown.
Fascinating.
But that doesn't make them unhappy.
Right. So that's a little bit of history, but let's jump to modern day just for a second. Culture. We are now canceling Disney World, or at least some of us apparently want to cancel Disney World for whatever. But haven't we exported real fun to the world? I constantly get surprised reading the newspaper that there's some Disney World or Disneyland in some other country. I didn't even know it was there. Like they were shut down because of COVID. And I go, wow, I didn't know they had a Disneyland in, blank country. Is it true that we're pretty good at entertainment and culture?
Yeah. I mean, the pop culture is one of America's great gifts to the world. but it's a result of prosperity. So Dennis Miller used to have this old joke where he said, no one finds God on prom night, but nobody makes pet sounds if they're dodging bullets. Like, in order to make a pop culture masterpiece like the Beach Boys album Pet Sounds, you have to have incredible resources marshaled behind creative types. And one of the things that's amazing about American culture is it produces so much prosperity that creative types are able to engage in art and engage in creative endeavors. And because of the commercial aspect of our markets, they can get paid to do so. But in order for all of that stuff to happen, you also have to have a willing audience, which, the creation of the factory system and wage labor, and then the limiting of hours by time. You don't think about this, but if labor was set by the sun, you work sun up to sundown. But once labor is set to a clock, you can begin creating this thing called a workday, and it can go from 12 hours, and then you can agitate to have it go down to 8 hours. But what this means is that for the last 100 years or so, our working classes have had both disposable income and time to enjoy leisure activities. And so that means that there are these financial incentives to create things for not just elites who have leisure time and money, but for everybody, which means that we have all of this money going to our the creation of pop culture that then is exported to the world, and we've been doing it for 120 years now.
And so we've gotten pretty good at it. It's not just Disney World and Disneyland. It's and I know this is dating myself because they rarely do it anymore, but all the McDonald's in Russia that are now closed down. I mean, heck, this McGrumpus guy and the Hamburglar and the Ronald McDonald, he was a little creepy, but he wasn't a creepy clown. He was just a little creepy. Yeah. We make eating a cheap hamburger, fun. And that's not necessarily a requirement of eating, is it? I mean, maybe there's a social aspect, but I mean, from Chuck E. Cheese to, the rainforest cafes. I mean, we do some pretty extraordinary things over food and drink, don't we?
Yeah, well, think about markets just push things to make things better. So everybody's looking for, well, how do I make this experience better? How do I differentiate myself from the competition? So it's not, so every aspect of the experience gets better, not just one part of it. That it's the centralized planning tends to think about what is this thing supposed to do, and does it do it adequately? And if it does, we can pump out this statistic that says we have now achieved this goal. But what markets do and what money does is it empowers the consumer on the other side, who are constantly voting with their dollars and always going to go for, when it's their money and that they have earned, they're always going to go for the best value for their dollar, which means they're going to be constantly evaluating what's better and then voting with their dollars for that thing.
Yeah, fascinating. Are there other countries that compete with us, or have we been dominant in this aspect of fun? You said for 100 years. I mean, we are a major contributor, but we're in some ways still, we're probably a superpower, but are we just a superpower in entertainment and culture, movies and music? And
well, I think you'd say that there are a lot of countries that punch above their weight. When you look at relatively small population centers, places like Ireland, it's just astounding for a place that's as small as it is, the cultural influence of Ireland, for instance. Or you could even make a case for Scotland too. But in terms of I think it's sort of the United States and Britain. But what you also have to have is you have to have a culture of free expression. So you can't just have a market economy. You have to have also a culture that values free expression, because having creative types need a wide berth. They need to be wrong. Art almost exclusively needs to be created by people who are wrong, who are young and arrogant and foolish and stupid, and believe that what they're doing is going to change the world, and they become obsessive and go too far and offend people with it, and then you have to have other people who are so wacky that they feel like that's what they want to throw their money at. So there are a lot of requirements, and what it means is that art and culture and literature and in every aspect of what it takes to create a popular culture, it requires all of these aspects, and there just aren't that many places that have all of those things, and so it tends to be places with Western values. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people who enjoy the pop culture that's created in their native lands. But what it means is that it's much more common to see pop culture exports in places that have that combination of factors.
Okay, I'm going to jump back to history again and then go back to music. So make sure I get back to music in just a minute or two here.
Okay.
Founding fathers. I know I've read some now because of you, and I've taken some history classes, but I really don't think of them as a funny group. Either the revolutionaries or the framers of the Constitution. Now, there's a notable exception. I do think of Ben Franklin being.
Yeah, I was going to say he's sort of unique in that he was funny. The other one,
he was intentionally looking for a laugh and good humor and drink and camaraderie and a different way of looking at things or a way to diffuse anger. It seemed like he was a pretty jolly guy.
Yeah, well, he's also somebody who valued humor, and I mean, there were other examples of people who were. Gouverneur Morris was another guy who everyone seemed to think was funny, and even if some of the most famous story of him being inappropriate is probably not true, but the fact that people told.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. So which one?
Oh, well, Gouverneur Morris.
Video.
This is always the story people tell to illustrate how Gouverneur Morris was inappropriate and what a stiff George Washington was. But before I tell the story, it's probably not true. But okay. Apparently, the story goes that that there was a bet that Gouverneur Morris would go up to George Washington, touch him on the shoulder, and say, "My dear General, you're looking well." Now, I get it. That's not exactly like a barn burner, but the idea was, you have no idea what a stiff George Washington was. So the idea that you would approach him, speak to him informally, and touch him on the shoulder was something you would have never done to him.
Wow.
And
so Washington was that godlike in our society? I didn't know that.
Yes, absolutely. You did not go up to him and touch him on the shoulder and say, "My dear General, you're looking well," or whatever. Like that would just never happen. But then apparently, again, this did not happen probably, but as the story goes, Gouverneur Morris goes up to Washington, does it, puts his hand on his shoulder, and Washington stares at him coldly and removes his hand and walks backward. And, and then Gouverneur Morris just shrinks at the affront that he has made.
Yeah, we're not a very fun country. You're proving the anti-argument now.
Oh, well, just most people were more like Gouverneur Morris than George Washington.
Okay.
I mean, he was unique in how seriously he took his public reputation. He really cultivated and created himself in such a way as to be the model of public character. And almost nobody dedicates themselves to that project. But Alexander Hamilton had a good sense of humor. Gouverneur Morris, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson had kind of an evil, wicked, it was more like mean. He was mean in a funny way sometimes, but being like sarcastic and mean,
biting, caustic humor.
Yeah, and hanging out with people who were, I mean, I remember, I don't know why this stuck out, but James Callender referring to George Washington as the Great Booby. I always thought that was funny, but they were definitely mean to each other and trying to do it in cutting ways. But you're right. Ben Franklin is a wit. He's funny.
Okay, so it's good to know we have some history. Let's go up to modern or near modern times. Music brings joy to many of our lives in a variety of ways. And there's no doubt American groups have brought great joy and humor and fun and interest around the world. So I'm thinking of famous American groups such as the Kinks and the Clash and the Cure. We Americans are just so talented that we're able to bring up this talent and export it to the world, right? On April Fool's Day, it's nice to recognize what we bring to the American music scene or the world music scene, right?
Yes. And you're bringing out something that we discovered, some friends and I discovered a few years ago, that the English have the best bands, Americans have the best solo artists. But I think it's also more of a function of, I guess, the differences in the pay structure in the creation of popular music is such that even today in America, it's really hard to make a band and have a band stick together, because almost immediately, I have friends who are musicians, and you're called upon to be a solo artist, and you make ends meet by writing music for TV shows and jingles and getting a side job, and it's very difficult to bring people together and keep them together. You almost need to do something like you be dedicated to it, like in a financial way, meaning that you in a band like U2, for instance, always split things 4 ways, and REM did the same thing. So that, yes, Michael Stipe is writing the lyrics, but everything else is split 4 ways. And you see that in a band that has stayed together a long time, like Metallica, for instance. I mean, that is a corporation. Or you end up doing what Bon Jovi did, which Bon Jovi is unique in that John Bon Jovi is Bon Jovi, and the band are employees. They are employees of this, corporation Bon Jovi, but it's almost because in the former days, most of the music, most of the money came from publishing and songwriting. But now with the growth of touring, I think we might see a shift because of the rise of streaming services, that there's almost no money in publishing anymore. All of the money comes from touring. So what we might see actually is a rise of more American bands. And I think you see that in bands like Wilco, who I don't know if you are aware of, but this is a band that headlines festivals nonstop. And we're starting to see more American bands because bands make their money from touring.
Yeah, so selling T-shirts, huh? Then become T-shirt salesman.
Concert tickets and club tickets, and it just because you went from making most of your money from songwriting royalties, and so the idea before was we're touring in order to sell records, but now the idea is, well, we're giving our songs away essentially for free to get you interested in coming to our shows.
Interesting. We're almost out of time, and we'll see if Ben or Bart have any questions, but I do want to jump in a little bit. There's been no fun wars, right? I even Googled Grenada, the invasion of Grenada under Reagan, because I thought that was kind of a flippant, weird little war after, I think it was the Lebanon, or the Beirut bombing. And then we invaded Grenada like the day after. And even at the time, I kind of thought it was weird that we're invading a Caribbean country. But we did lose some Marines, and there were some civilian deaths, and we accidentally bombed somebody, And so anyway, I didn't find any humor to it. And in retrospect, I thought it was funny at the time that we're superpowers invading a little island. But I don't know. Is there any fun in war? Is there any fun in depression? Is there any fun in terrorism? There's just a lot of brutality still in the world, and always has been, right?
Yeah, but there's always humor in it. I remember I mean, some of the best presidential one-liners were things that came from events that could otherwise be tragic. I mean, Elihu Root had one of the most like devastating lines against Theodore Roosevelt over the building of the Panama Canal. I don't know if you know this story, but Theodore Roosevelt was angry that people were accusing him of stealing the Panama Canal, and he brings his cabinet together, and he says, he lays out his case for why that's not true, and I think Elihu Root was the Attorney General at the time. I can't remember what he was at the time, but he was after Theodore Roosevelt lays out his case. He says, Theodore Roosevelt, turns to the group and demands, have I done it? Have I exonerated myself? Have I proved my case? And Elihu Root says, well, you've conclusively proved that you were accused of seduction, but guilty of rape.
Right. Gosh.
And the room burst out in laughter. Some other good one-liners at cabinet meetings that stuck out with me is Dwight Eisenhower liked to start cabinet meetings with a prayer, but there was some world crisis that started once, and John Foster Dulles was a really uptight Presbyterian, and that's saying something, for a member of the Frozen Chosen. And one time they started one of their meetings without praying first, and halfway through the meeting, Eisenhower just burst out, "God damn it, Foster, we forgot the prayer." And Reagan was very funny.
Reagan was, I think, funny, and I know a lot of people don't. Some people don't like him still to this day, but I think he really was pretty funny, wasn't he? He liked looking for a laugh and a bond and a human connection.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You don't have to go very far to find plenty of Reagan one-liners about everything. I mean, he always wanted to begin with a joke. So on almost every topic, there is a Reagan joke about it. Right. That is somebody would.
Any other funnier presidents than Reagan?
That's a good question. Funnier presidents than Reagan? Certainly not Biden or Trump or Carter. Clinton was okay. Bush was like always jokey. He was always jokey, but he wasn't like that hilarious.
43, you mean?
Yeah. George H.W. Bush, he had a pretty good sense of humor about himself sometimes.
Yeah, but only in a stiff way.
I don't know. Who was actually quietly in my sense of humor, who I loved his humor, was Calvin Coolidge, who knew that he had this reputation of being uptight. And so one of the things that he would do, it's almost like a performance art joke, is he would have his picture taken in ridiculous settings, knowing that I'm going to look ridiculous. And so if you look up Calvin Coolidge, you can find these pictures of him like wearing a cowboy outfit with chaps that say Cal down the side, with a big Hopalong Cassidy 10-gallon hat. And for many years, my profile picture was a picture of Calvin Coolidge wearing this Indian headdress, but like looking off in the distance with a very serious expression. I don't know, here's another story that might not be true, but there's a very famous.
That's what historians are for, is stories that may not be true. Thank you, Professor.
Well, these stories become famous because they're apocryphal, like they indicate, oh, this is really what he was like. And there's a story of Alice Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, who was a real spitfire, and she knew that Coolidge had this reputation for never speaking, and she sidles up next to him at a party one time and says, I have a bet with someone that I can get you to say more than 3 words tonight. What do you have to say to that? And Coolidge says, you lose. 2 words. I appreciated that, and then people like Harding was apparently, like to have a good time, and Taft had a pretty good sense of humor. Franklin Roosevelt, pretty good sense of humor. Harry Truman, he liked to, party and have a good time, bourbon and Benedictine, Eisenhower really only let his hair down among, people who he really trusted. Nixon, almost all of his humor was unintentional, but I found Nixon hilarious at various times. The fact that he would go walking, he was so uptight that he would go walking on the beach in his, loafers. And there's, I think there was a footage of him putting out a fire with a garden hose, and he's wearing a suit. He wore a suit every day in all circumstances. So he ended up being, Carter was pretty humorless, actually. The funnest one almost always is Theodore Roosevelt. He just had so much zest and joy for life. And here's a story that is, true of him enjoying someone else's sense of humor. He used to go for these epic hikes, all around DC. And one time he was with the French ambassador, and they would swim naked in the Potomac. It's like strip down and go for a swim, And he was going to go for a swim with this, I think, French ambassador. And they said, and the French ambassador left his gloves on. And he said, well, in case we run into any ladies, I don't want to be naked. And Theodore Roosevelt thought that was like the funniest thing anybody had ever said,
That is pretty funny.
Yeah. And his kids would do stuff like ride horses through the White House, and he just loved it all. He thought everything was just a big joke. And the other thing that is something I tell my classes, I don't know if you're familiar with the TV show Veep or the TV show House of Cards, but one of the things that I do say about politics is that politics is more like Veep than House of Cards. It's not a conspiracy of evil people who are really smart, who are executing these well thought out plans. It's really a bunch of people who cuss a lot, running around saying, what are we doing? And
what's going on here?
And trying to further some agenda that serves no one's interest, and not even their own. It's much more like Veep than House of Cards.
Funny. Well, Professor, I'm out of time, so I didn't even get to talk about literary geniuses in humor. Mark Twain. We didn't talk about MASH or heck, the Brady Bunch, or even our weird stuff from the 70s, like H.R. Puffin stuff and the Slee Snack stuff, or Land of the Lost. We've put out some weird, funny stuff. I'm not sure they were funny at the time, but boy, they're funny now, man. And then, we've got our comedians and even like Muhammad Ali, one of the most famous people in the world. It was funny. I mean, he had even his entertainment zeal was arrogant and funny. I mean, it was weird.
Let me just throw in the TV show Arrested Development, which when it was on at the time, I remember thinking like, we need to take a moment and realize that this is the American version of what Monty Python was. I mean, this was nothing but every single moment of that show before it went to Netflix, but was just packed with absurd humor and I've recently been rewatching it with my kids, and it's just amazing that how much humor is packed into each one of those. And I would say Veep is one of those shows also, but you can't watch that with your kids. But well, I guess you can. Your kids are older, but
ours are adults now. But
yeah.
So the answer is, we can, as a historian, I don't think you're board certified, but as an accredited PhD doctor of history, you can authoritatively state that America is fun and funny. Even sometimes we don't act like it.
Absurd. America is absurd and ridiculous. I mean, when I think about, every now and then I'll meet somebody who's just somebody who I consider to be a true wacko, like a true whack job in a way that's very unique to my hometown. And all of my friends will say, yeah, that guy's a real Visalian. Like that is a true Visalia wacko, there's, and every region has their own, every city, every town has their own version of something that is completely insane, completely just wacko absurd, that we just tolerate and say, hey, that's our local this, and I know that there's somebody like that in your town.
Yeah, so we don't have them in our town, but the rent is too damn high party with the guy with the boot on his head.
Yeah, I mean, just, well, like the old lady at the gym who tells the guy at the front that there's a fox in the pool. Like, I don't know what she's doing, and then you look around the pool that on any given morning, and there's the guy who just sits there and he goes out there and gets sun for a certain number of minutes, and you think like, well, that's a little bit wacky. Like, why the sun is everywhere? Why do you go to the gym and sit in a chair in order to get the sun here instead of somewhere else? I don't know. I don't get it. There was a guy I knew who he would put handles on rocks because he was like, rocks need handles. Like, why? I don't know. He sold them.
He sold them.
Yeah. What do you do for a living? I sell these rocks with handles. Like, okay. Like, I know I can start going through the litany of just true whack. I have a friend who got into this music scene where you pretend that you are writing about like some sort of Germanic legendary place, but you make the music for a movie that doesn't exist about an unknown Germanic place with like Vikings and fairies and stuff. And you're like, okay. And he makes guitars out of cigar boxes. And you're like, all right. Like, and by the way, these are both like different personas, and okay. I guess that's what we're doing now, And I love it all, by the way. I think it's all great.
And Professor, I did an experiment about a month ago, maybe 6 months ago now. My excuse, it was during the pandemic still, but I looked up, I typed in not dirty words, but unusual words or unusual hobbies or unusual names into Facebook groups. And there's something like 100 million Facebook groups, and there are the most obscure, weird, nuanced, crazy people, and they have like 10,000 people in them doing weird jokes and weird stories and the little subcultures. Yeah, it is a really weird world we're in now.
Well, one of my favorite things to name things is the name of the group that Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon started for young congressmen. They called themselves the Chowder and Marching Society. And like, that's absurd. Yeah, like we're the Chowder and Marching Society. Like, what does that even mean? I don't, but yeah, like Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford were in the Chowder and Marching Society,
Wow.
And again, two guys who you don't necessarily think of as being hilarious, but I mean, my friends and I, when we were in high school, that was like the height of gang violence, and we decided we were going to have a gang, and we named it the Apple Dumpling Gang after and to this day, when I get a text message from my three closest friends, the name of that group chat is the Apple Dumpling Gang.
Yeah.
It's the year 2022. We started calling ourselves the Apple Dumpling Gang in, I think, 1989. So
yeah, you haven't grown out of it.
Yeah. In fact, that's who I'm going to probably hang out with this afternoon, is the members of the Apple Dumpling Gang, right? Because we were going to be tough, like the Bloods and the Crips.
Oh yeah, right.
And that was the name we chose to really intimidate everyone with our gang.
That's funny. Well, to me, I do think we need to look for the good spirit and the elements of happiness, or even humor, and unfortunately I didn't serve in war. But even in Army training, we were constantly silly. Even if we're going to get yelled at and do push-ups in basic training, or if we're in a exercise, we were constantly looking for a joke. And even just the, it's raining, but God, I wish it wasn't raining on a forced road march in the middle of the night. And somebody go, yeah, but at least it's cold, and somebody else will go, yeah, and slippery. Yeah. And, it's just like this constant series of jokes to make something miserable more tolerable. I like that stuff.
Well, I remember, I'm just remembering like all this stuff. But first of all, Arlie Ermey's performance in Full Metal Jacket, which is absurd and funny and hilarious, and stole that movie. But then the examples you were giving just reminded me of also sports, and some of the most hilarious moments will come from sports. I remember hearing our offensive line for our high school football team. They're small, but they're slow.
Yeah.
And my friend who had the record for a member of the Apple Dumpling gang, who had the record for the most dropped interceptions. And I remember his father just shaking his head saying, I can't believe he eats with those hands. Like his hands are worthless. He just, he drops interceptions. That's what he does. Well, that's how he's not a wide receiver, right? If he could catch, he'd be a wide receiver.
Funny. Well, I hope we provided some value today, but before we go, Bart, do you have something to add or a question for the professor?
I'm almost reluctant to ask this question because this conversation has been great, and this will kind of mar it because it's too serious.
Oh.
Shocking.
Okay, so I'm going to keep talking through my seriousness, so maybe something funny will come out. I think one of the reasons that we are as funny as we are in this country is because of what I think Jonah Goldberg calls the miracle. We have, the free market, as well, and this is the serious part, as well as our constitutional rights, because people are not afraid of expressing themselves, although I think Will Smith maybe ran counter to that on Sunday night, but let's say kind of, that was a one-off, so we're not going to go there. But do you think historically that has helped us? Because people are able to just kind of say things that I think in other countries, people are very reluctant to say.
Yes, and I would say it's interesting because of what's going on in Ukraine. One of the things that is true about, for instance, Russian history and Russian culture is that my old professors used to say that studying Russian history is like seeing Technicolor for the first time, because no matter what the example is in the United States, there's something that happened in Russia that was 1,000 times worse, or 10,000 times worse. And so there's a kind of depth to everything that Russians do, from high culture and literature and that sort of thing. And so their jokes are hilarious, but usually based on something that is so deep and so tragic. And I'll tell another story about a guy I met right after it wasn't right after. This was probably 1998. And I was talking with a Soviet historian. Somebody who had lived in Russia during the Soviet era, was a historian in Russia who had come to the United States. And I remember asking him, what was good about the Soviet Union? He took him a while but eventually he said that one of the things that will never happen again, nor would he ever want it to happen again, is that he said, I'll never have friends like that again, because sharing a joke with someone meant you were trusting them with your life. And it's true that when a joke means I'm trusting you with my life, that's pretty weighty stuff. But when the joke hits in that context, it often is deeply funny in a way that an outsider would not be able to appreciate. So in a way, our humor and British humor tends to be jokey and lighter, and doesn't have often it doesn't land with the depth that humor like that would have in a place where telling a joke means I'm trusting you with my life because you could turn me in for this joke and receive a reward for doing so. But I think I still prefer our way.
Even if it's slapstick and silly and immature sometimes.
Well, I've never been a big fan of like the Three Stooges, but I love the Marx Brothers. I think what's amazing about the Marx Brothers is that you can still watch the Marx Brothers, and if you skip the sort of parts of the movies that are dated, and skip to just the Marx Brothers being the Marx Brothers, skip the musical numbers that don't involve the brothers themselves. One of the most amazing things is you can watch a Groucho Marx routine and it's still funny. It's amazing to me that that humor has really held up. And Bugs Bunny, which is kind of based on Marx Brothers, a lot of that stuff really does hold up. And that to me is just astonishing. I'm amazed when humor can still be funny 100 years later, because so much of humor is based on common cultural references, but things that are, this is one of the sort of weirder things about pop culture, though, that we haven't really thought about too much, and that is that American language has become more standardized over the past 100 years because all pop culture exists simultaneously. To my kids, when I'm playing something on Spotify, they don't know if it's a song that's from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, 2020s. So in essence, the last 50 years of pop culture kind of exists simultaneously for most consumers of pop culture. And that has a sort of strange effect on language. There's a way that, yes, things from the 50s and 60s can still be funny now. But you take, for instance, something like The Office, was a hit-ish show for NBC, but it became more hilarious as the world grew more absurd in that direction. So in a way, it's in the 2020s when The Office became funnier, because the world had become more filled with HR trainings and uptight bosses trying to negotiate the politically correct new world.
Funny. Bart, did that answer your question on Jonah?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, because boy, what a talent. I'm not sure I generally describe him or his activities as funny, but boy, what a great talent. Ben, do you have any thoughts or questions for the professor?
Well, we were talking a little bit ago about history and talking about Reagan and stuff like that. I agree. Reagan, to me, was, of all the presidents that I know in my lifetime, probably the funniest. But one of the things that kind of struck me, and I've talked to my wife about this before, talk about TV shows and politics. And according to Hollywood, and I don't want to get too deep into politics because we want to keep this kind of lighthearted, but have you noticed that the Democrats are a whole lot funnier than the Republicans are on TV?
Well, I heard this. I actually heard a conversation between Bill Maher and Quentin Tarantino from last week, where Bill Maher tried to answer that as a question, and he said that it's because of the way, and this is his answer, and Bill Maher, certainly no friend of Republicans, but he said it's because of the way that the way in which the politicians are ridiculous. In other words, when Nancy Pelosi says something that is absurd, it will never compare to Sarah Palin, who was around at the time, because there is no, Kamala Harris, to compare how Sarah Palin was absurd is completely different from how Kamala Harris is absurd. Or I'm saying her name wrong, Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is absurd, but not in a funny way. Sarah Palin, it's kind of, I mean, you remember what she was like.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it wasn't good, you know, like, and Tina Fey was able to sort of nail her for being the way she was. And Kamala Harris is like, how do you parody that? You know, Barack Obama was harder to make fun of than Donald Trump. It's just and Bill Maher's point, I guess, is that there's just so much low-hanging fruit, because the in a way you could almost say it's because the way that Democrats are absurd is more dangerous and less funny. You know, I'm trying to remember the last sort of Democrat who was funny and the object of humor. I mean, I guess Joe Biden. People make fun of Joe Biden a lot. You know, Joe Biden is an easy target for humor. I mean,
But he's
He
low-hanging
tries
fruit.
to be funny and he tries to be weird.
well, I think, but you know, when he tells the story about, which is what's crazy about this, the story about Corn Pop is that it is a true story. But when he tells the story of confronting the gang member named Corn Pop, it's funny, like it's absurd. You know, I don't know if you know this story, but you know, Joe Biden was a lifeguard, and there was a leader of the local street gang named Corn Pop. And just like, if his name wasn't Corn Pop, maybe we would. Maybe this wouldn't be hilarious, but the guy's name was Corn Pop. So, and when you're a really old man and you're trying to say like, oh, I used to be a tough guy and I, you know, faced down Corn Pop, like it's just, so Joe Biden, there you go. We've got our first, like, you know, and I always thought Phil Hartman did a nice job making fun of Bill Clinton, for instance. I thought Phil Hartman's Bill Clinton was pretty good. But and obviously the overall ideological slant of Hollywood. I mean, just basically, you have a tendency to make fun of whoever is in power, and it's just a sort of a fact that between, you know, Reagan was in power for 8 years and Bush was, so you had a good 12-year period, and then Clinton comes along and they made fun of him. I always thought that Norm Macdonald did a great Bob Dole. You know, Bob Dole had one of the best one-liners of all time.
Yeah, that's true.
When he saw Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan together, he said, look, it's see no evil, hear no evil, and evil. Which, you know, and then Norm Macdonald did such a great job with his parody of Bob Dole. I loved Norm Macdonald's Bob Dole because I think he got to what was actually great about Bob Dole, which is stuff like that, you know. But then, you know, by the time you get to the 90s, yeah, people made fun of Clinton, and then Bush was actually harder. I don't think anybody ever really nailed Bush that well. I mean, Will Ferrell, I guess, was the one who.
Not gonna happen. Not gonna happen.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, Dana Carvey did a great George H.W. Bush, but I mean, George W. Bush, Will Ferrell, I guess, was the one that was, and I love Will Ferrell, but I just don't think that it really nailed a lot of that. But except for the, you know, the debate one where he said strategery,
yeah.
you know, that was great. And what's great about it is that Bush later used that word.
Used it.
You know, he like, so, you know, he thought it was hilarious. But you know, Obama just didn't really lend himself much to humor too much. Ray, you know who else I thought did a really nice job on Saturday Night Live was Phil Hartman. Did this one sketch where he was Ronald Reagan, portraying himself as somebody who, the nice guy was just a facade. And then as soon as the door closed, he's like, back to work, and, you know, starts screaming at people. I always thought that was a hilarious
Remember that one.
Hilarious if true version of Reagan,
It's interesting that you brought up all these folks. Clearly Lauren Michaels is probably one of the most influential people in the last 40 years or whatever it's been.
Yeah,
creating humor in all sorts of genres.
And what's really amazing is that, let me say, like, I'm the first person to say, music in 1968 was better than music in the year 2022, but how much better Saturday Night Live got over the years. I mean, a lot of those early years of Saturday Night Live were not good.
Coneheads and Killer Bees. Come on.
I mean, have you watched any of those things?
Come on. Those are classic, Professor.
You only think they were funny because of the competition. Go back and watch some of those early episodes. But it started getting really good in the 80s, especially when they brought in some of those SCTV guys, and how it progressively got better. And now what's really amazing when I watch Saturday Night Live, I don't watch it every week, but I'm just shocked at there's this sort of transition by the 80s and 90s where the number of bad sketches goes really far down. Like they'll still have a stinker every now and then, but really the quality of the show is pretty amazing. And every year I think, wow, this cast is just amazing. We always look back with nostalgia on the cast, and I think every sort of like 12-year-old boy thinks that whenever you were 12, that version of Saturday Night Live was the best. But I think it's also just because 12-year-old boys like sketch comedy. But yeah, you think about some of the performers who've cycled through there in the last 10 years. Yeah, Kristen Wiig. It's almost every one of those. Molly Shannon, or and they're not even the ones who became super famous, because Adam Sandler or David Spade or something like that, they all became famous later. But in Saturday Night Live, they were not. They hadn't really. I mean, they had a couple of hit characters or something. Will Ferrell, I think about how many classic characters Will Ferrell created on Saturday Night Live. Anyway, enough about SNL. I think that SNL is actually a pretty good indication of just how funny America is. I mean, in terms of just an institution that has just been pumping out good. Look at The Simpsons. I mean, the writing on The Simpsons is astounding. How good it is.
How predictive it can be. I mean, like they predict things 5 or 10 years into the future and it comes true.
And I think they've been doing it for 32 years now. I mean, it's to have a show that's that good that my kids laugh at still. And we, they're on season 18 of 32, that's a lot of episodes of very high quality.
Thank you, Colorado.
Yeah. Well, South Park, let's mention, I mean, the speaking of Colorado, the South Park guys, I mean, didn't they just buy that place,
not that place,
the Casa Bonita? Is that what
that's the
place? I went there.
That's just plain funny.
Yeah, I went there to see it for myself when I lived in Colorado. So it was
horrible.
It was every bit what I had. It was everything I hoped it would be.
Yeah, horrible. But you have to do it.
It's in like a bad-ish part of town. Not a bad part of town, but it's in the middle of a strip mall. It's like, what? Where am I? And then you walk in and like there's cliff divers and
the gorilla.
Yeah, you want to talk about something that is American and completely absurd, right? Everything about that experience, that's what makes America great, right there. Like bad Mexican food and cliff diving in a strip mall. And what city is it in?
Lakewood.
Yeah, in Lakewood. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad. And the fact that the South Park guys are the ones who saved it, it just makes it even better.
I know. That's absurd in itself. All right, Tom, it looks like we're way over time, so forgive us for chatting about popular culture. Any other one-liners, Ben, Bart, Professor? What did you think the show was going to be about? Did we cover some of it?
Yeah, no, the show is exactly what I'd hoped for.
Oh, good. I had no. Excellent.
Well, and I do think we need to, and maybe it's just me, I think you're probably fine, but I do think we need to look for humor better. It seems like there's just so much anger out there, and some of it's fake anger and some of it's, posturing anger, but there's some real anger out there too. And I don't know, I think humor is the great equalizer, and it brings people together, and you ask somebody, and there's a ton of people that are angry in the grocery store. And if you can figure out a way to make them smile or laugh, it just makes everybody's day. And we should do it more.
Can I just grab like one point of privilege and tell you the funniest story about my great uncle Bill? This is a good example of like his sense of humor, and it was just perfect. Some old man comes to me at church and he's like, "You related to Bill Tootle?" Yeah, it's my uncle, my great uncle, my grandpa's brother. Said, "Your Uncle Bill, he was the funniest SOB I ever met." And I said, "Yeah, oh yeah, he really was. He was hilarious." He said, "I went in there once and he was working at the Mayfair market and he was stacking up peaches. And some old lady comes in there and says, 'How much are your peaches?' And he says, 'Well, signs on them.' He said, 'Well, they're 3 for $1.00. He said, "Yeah." And the lady said, "Well, over at Best Buy, they're 6 for $1.00. And he says, "Well, that's the place to get them." And the lady says, well, they done run out. He said, "Well, when we run out, they're 7 for $1."
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, everything about that, I loved it all, right? The signs on them, right? If they're cheaper at Best Buy, buy them there. And then when we run out, they're 7 for $1. And the fact that like his brain just went that fast. I mean, I absolutely love that about my Uncle Bill. And it's a good example of someone who never took anybody or anything seriously. Everything was a joke to him. And same way with all of my grandpa and his brothers. They were all like that. My Uncle Alan, at his 100th birthday, some old man comes up to him and says, "Hey, he's like almost got tears in his eyes. He comes up to my Uncle Alan and says, "This, us old timers, this might be the last time we see each other." And my Uncle Alan looked at him and said, "I'll piss on your grave."
I'll see you again.
Like, what are you talking about? And he was talking about his own death, and he was joking about it. And, I think there's a lesson in there for us, sometimes you just and I get in trouble for this a lot, I make a joke about everything, even when something's serious, and yeah, all right, I'm sorry, but look where I come from. I mean,
got to find family tree of it, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Can't help it.
Nice. Well, Professor, sure appreciate your time. Let's continue to do good work with each other, and very much appreciate it. Ben and Bart, what an honor to have you here as regulars. I'm declaring victory. Let's say hi for a minute after the thing, but I'm pausing it right now.